שיר למעלות, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם השם.
Welcome to another edition of A Voice to the Gentile Church. I'm Jim Wingerter. This is Pastor Roger Diaz and Dolores Lowe, our regular panel. And so we're gonna begin with some current events tonight. And son of a gun, Israel's opening up to tourism.
Yep. So the Ministry of Tourism announced that on May 23rd, they are going to open tourism in a phased approach for vaccinated individuals. Everyone coming into Israel will have to be vaccinated, hop on the plane, and get a PCR test before going, right? So before you get on your plane, you got to have a COVID test. And then when you land in Ben Gurion, you have to have a serum test. That means they're going to take your blood to verify that, yes, truly you've been vaccinated.
And I don't make the rules, but if truly I've been vaccinated, why do I have to have a COVID up the nose test?
I don't know. That's a great question. And the thing is think about it. Everybody's got to get their blood taken. The blood has to be processed for the antibodies. It's going to be a nightmare, unless they're expecting very few tourists, right?
I think they're expecting business as usual. I think they're expecting that things will get back to the pre-COVID period. It's going to be difficult because I know without any question, many Christians, they're tourists. Many of them will not take the vaccine and would not surrender to it. So that's a difficult position for Israel. That's a tough place to be in because so much of their economy depends on tourism, and they're certainly, if they force this COVID agenda, it's going to be tough on their tourism. It's going to be tough on the country in general. I guess they're seeing that they don't have a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're also jumping on the immunization bandwagon, the global ID that Microsoft has proposed, where when you get immunized, you get this digital ID that says you've been immunized, right? Because if you go and get a test and it's a paper, right, those can be faked. So the globalists are saying, let's do a global ID to be immunized. That says you're immunized.
And Israel's on board with that?
They
Wow.
said that this phased approach is until they can achieve that.
This is a difficulty for us because it represents an awful lot of government control. And it's more awkward for us that it's Israel that's spearheading it.
So I'm going to throw the elephant in the room on the table, right? And this is for Roger. So I know that there are people within Christianity who are immediately saying, this is the mark of the beast.
Right.
What do you think?
No, I don't think it's the actual mark of the beast, but it's control and manipulation from the beast. And the beast there, of course, relates to Daniel chapter 7, Revelation chapter 13 to 19. The beast is a global kingdom from the standpoint of the Bible. A global kingdom, 10 horns representing 10 kings or 10 kingdoms that will comprise of this global system. What's really gripping about this is that today we're seeing a global order, and behind the whole COVID agenda is the global government. They are 100% behind it.
To me, the shocking thing
So
this week...
the beast is a system. This is not the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast has to do with your spiritual position. Where are you spiritually? This is simply control, and ultimately it's going to be used ultimately to sift out the masses, to sort of cull the masses, polarize and so on.
Yeah. So one of the shocking things this week was, the volcano that's spewing out at the island of St. Vincent. And
La Soufrière.
Right. And the Prime Minister said that if you were not vaccinated for COVID, they wouldn't take you off the island. So it seems, we're going to save lives by killing lives, but hey.
Yeah, that is a part of, those Caribbean islands are very much on board with the whole global agenda. This global agenda that we talk about so often the so-called New World Order, and that's not our terminology, that's their own terminology.
Right.
The so-called New World Order has been at work for a long, long time. Now, here in the Bible South, you don't feel the effects of it much. But around the world, in the Caribbean, different parts of the world, it's right there. It's before everyone, and everyone is working towards that. Well, all of the countries are working towards that final goal of a new world order, a one world government. So St. Vincent, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent, is absolutely on board with this global governance scenario. And I'm devastated that he's doing that, but I'm not surprised that he is. So that's what I'm referring to. This is COVID, and any catastrophe actually anything that happens is going to be used to polarize.
Yep.
You know, there was a meteor that came over on Monday night, and it was seen as far as from the Keys all the way up to north central Florida. It was a good-sized object, right? I saw it. I happened to be coming around a bend, and it flashed across me.
I saw a video of it.
Now, if that was a more perpendicular shot at the Earth, in other words, if the trajectory of it was more direct, and it did hit, it could have been a minor catastrophe, and even that would have been used by this whole system to continue the control factor. So I think, for believers, we have to get used to this, because this is not going to go away.
Yep.
It's going to permeate every aspect of our lives. But it's sad to see Israel in that place. I think Israel is front and center, and that's unfortunate right now. Front and center in this, and acquiescing to the whole global order.
But it's very awkward for them, because tourism is such a primary part of their economy.
It's everything to them, yeah.
Right.
It's unfortunate, but they're going to lose a lot of their tourists, and there's nothing anybody can do about it.
Right.
Really. Hopefully, the hope is that after a year or so, they will kind of come to their senses. If there isn't another strain of the SARS virus, there could be another strain of it. So, what do you know about the SARS virus and COVID?
So, my gosh. So, you remember Rahm Emanuel, right? He used to be mayor of Chicago,
yeah,
and he used that famous line, "Never let a crisis go. Always exploit a crisis," basically, right?
Right.
So this is just another one of the mini crisis. The latest word is that there's now a double variant of the virus that is loose, particularly in Florida, right? Because we have an influx of people from Europe. So first it was the virus, and you gotta hide and cover yourself, and the whole bit, lock yourself away. Then now it's waning. People aren't paying as much attention anymore. So all of a sudden we have all these variants coming out, right? And I claim that we live in the free state of Florida, because Florida, in comparison to other states,
yes,
it's
true.
Oh my gosh.
I lived in Pennsylvania for a while. I called it the state of rigor mortis.
So I don't know. It is still out there. It is climbing. Originally, when it all happened, I thought, okay, we're pretty certain the virus was created in a Chinese lab, and it was genetic modification. So yes, I can understand that they're all nervous that it's exploding, and who knows what it's going to do, right? But now we no longer have the flu because we have COVID.
Right.
So I
You know, the evidence for saying that, other than citing sources, would just flat out be the unnaturalness of the virus. It doesn't bear any of the natural things that other similar viruses have bore.
Well, so if you are deficient in magnesium, vitamin D3, or zinc, you're predisposed to get it, and your reaction is worse,
me.
right? People of certain ethnic heritages, like, my husband is a redhead, pasty white guy. He's more.
He's especially the
more
Irish.
Susceptible, right? More susceptible. So yes, it's definitely got some weird things associated with it. And then what makes it worse is all the different. Once you have gotten over COVID, all the different things that are still in your body. Like there's a doctor in California who claims that what is really happening is that your body has an overactive immune response, and it's still left in your body after the virus is gone. So, I mean, it's just crazy how many different things this virus can do to you.
Right. And
So what I want to know is, does your husband allow you to define him that way? Wow.
or
Yes.
Brian doesn't watch
How
the
does
show.
he define you?
I don't know, but I'm the opposite, right?
So things are tough. It's painful to see Israel in this place, but we'll talk about Israel here in a moment. Now, what's happening in this country?
Yeah,
it
it's
seems
painful to
like
see what's going on here.
things are just unraveling all around us.
Yep. So in the excuse of tolerance, right? Oh, we're going to be tolerant of everyone and kind to everyone. We are accepting every level of immorality and actually
Right.
giving precedence to that level of immorality, right? So for example, we're defunding police, law and order, so that criminals can feel better. That's really what's happening, right? We are paying for transgender people to compete in women's sports at the expense of women because
Right, because they
sports-
can't compete with it.
Right.
Right.
Sports at that level is really about getting a college scholarship.
Right.
And now you have someone who is in essence a man because I'm sorry, I work out and I do a whole lot of upper body and I can never compete with a man in my
No,
upper
right.
body. That's not going to
That's
happen.
a given.
Right.
Right.
And now
Neither can I.
And now you have girls losing out on college scholarships because they're being taken by what are in essence men, right?
Yeah, it's
Um,
incredible.
LGBTQXYZ. I'm just going to call because every day there's another letter, right?
The thing that really floors me about that, I never questioned my sexuality because my parents raised me with the understanding that God doesn't make mistakes.
Right.
And so you are what you are because God made you that way, and accept that.
Right.
And engage in that. Be what God made you to be. As simple as being a woman or being a man.
Well, and the thing is, it's now become fashionable.
Right.
You know, as someone who coaches sports, right? I have had players who were straight today, gay tomorrow, straight the next day.
Right.
And you're like,
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you know, what's really tragic about this is that the church is supposed to be a light in the midst of the community, right? A pointer that points to morality and what is just, what is right, what is biblical. Everything I'm hearing from people who are going out and attending some of these churches out there, the main churches, you know, the mainstream churches, are telling me that the church has effectively grabbed the ball and they have run with it. They're doing exactly what
The world is
the world
Yeah.
system
They
would want them to do, which is to capitulate. That's horrifying because the church is and has always been an anchor in the community of righteousness and what is acceptable from God's perspective. I think it all comes to this fact: we're living in an unprecedented time. We live in a time that the Bible refers to as the time of the tribulation, but we're not quite there yet. But we certainly seem to be going in that direction. So Jim, we have a question.
Yes, we do.
Maybe you want to read that for us.
Put my glasses on.
Jim's our official reader of words. He's our reader of many words.
Do we live in the time of the great and final ingathering of Israel, or could Israel be dispersed yet again?
So, why is that question relevant? The question is relevant now. Why is it relevant now? Because we're seeing these occurrences in Israel where Israel seemed to be capitulating to a world system that we have determined to be the New World Order, or the beast of Revelation chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 13 to 19 and Daniel chapter 7. We recognize this system to be the beast, and we're seeing Israel not only capitulating but actually spearheading an effort that's been proposed by the global government. This is tragic. And so many times in considering this and considering where Israel is it possible that Israel might, because of her willingness to capitulate to a world system, the beast system, could she be driven out again? Now this question has been posed many times, and the first time I heard it, it really gripped me. It was it was a question that Pastor Ken Garrison posed at our Bible class one night, and I was shocked by the question. Could that actually happen? And it forced me to think. It compelled me to examine my faith and to consider even my knowledge of the Bible. I had to dig deep to arrive at a suitable answer for myself. And the question was good. It was necessary. It challenged me and others to really think.
Well, and Israel came under judgment when they were apostate.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the communities we work with in Judea and Samaria are strong in faith,
Yeah.
Right.
but the communities of Haifa and Tel Aviv are not so
Yeah, it's
wonderful.
just like New York.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the entire entity of Israel, the entire nation of Israel. And so the question needs to be addressed. Now, historically, Israel has always been accountable to God. And even from the time of the Exodus and the time of the conquest of the land was never really conquered by Israel. Joshua and the people of Israel, they didn't carry through with it completely. The land was never cleansed
Right.
of the Canaanites. So the conquest was never complete. So during that period of the Judges, and we've been studying this in our Bible class, there was a horrible cycle of sin and the consequence of sin, rebellion. Then Israel will cry out. God will send a judge, and there was this cycle. Ultimately, the sin in Israel led to God driving Israel out, right? And so we know that story well. So how does that relate to today? We see Israel capitulating in different ways. For instance, this peace accords that's being established now with the Arab nations, as if somehow the Arab nations are suddenly amiable, really truly amiable with Israel, or is there some deception there? I think certainly there is some deception.
Right.
So-
Go ahead.
So the new change in administration is definitely not pro-Israel, right?
Never has been.
Never had, well, right,
That the president has always been anti-Israel.
right. And they just reinstated $267 million to the Palestinians.
You meant the change in American administration.
American
Yes,
administration.
yes.
So I think that hopefully they're getting the picture that things are not as they appear, right? And then this past week, Israel took out Iran's nuclear capability with a cyber attack, and now the Iranians are saying they're gonna go after Israel.
So Israel can expect no help from the current administration. In fact, they could expect resistance from the current administration, which is very unfortunate. So we don't want to get into the prior administration and how favorable it was to Israel. Israel is where she is now. Israel should always trust in God and not an American administration.
Amen.
Good or bad.
Right.
So God had determined from the very beginning, I'm talking now about Mount Sinai. God had determined from Mount Sinai that should Israel continue in the path that she was on at that time with a propensity towards rebellion, that he would have to drive Israel out. It was stated at Mount Sinai, Leviticus chapter 26. God stated clearly, this was at Mount Sinai, Leviticus chapter 26. This is before Israel left Sinai to head out to Kadesh Barnea. So at Sinai, Moses, speaking on behalf of God, spoke this incredible chapter 26 of Leviticus. In this chapter, he outlines the process of punishment, chastisement that God will bring upon Israel should Israel rebel against him, and the conclusion of that. So we want to take a look at this. It begins with Leviticus chapter 26, 1 and 2, where God states, and Jim, you can read that for us.
You shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord.
So, reverent his sanctuary, keep it holy, observe the Shabbats, and refrain from idolatry. This is how the chapter begins. So you have a criteria of 3 things that God expects. Now, let's talk about the Shabbats. We know what idolatry is. We know what the desanctification of a temple is. We know it involves sin. Our bodies are living temples, and if we transgress against God in our bodies, we defile these temples. So we understand that well. Now, the Shabbats. Now, note he said, my Shabbats, plural. Would be Shabbatot? No. No.
Shabbaot.
Shabbaot. So, he said, don't violate my Shabbats. So the inference there, it's not just the weekly Shabbats he's referring to, but all of the Shabbats, the land Shabbats, the annual Shabbats,
Right.
and on and on and on. So don't violate his Shabbats. Now, we have the historicity of Israel, where Israel did not honor the Shabbat. Even during the period of the Judges, it's evident that the festivals were not being celebrated, and the Shabbats were being violated. The land Shabbats in particular. Now, the rest of Leviticus chapter 26, I'm just going to relate here before we get to the end of it. So this is what God said. Now, following those two verses, God says to Israel in Leviticus 26, if you were to obey me and follow after me closely, here are the blessings that will come upon you. You will have prosperity, your land will bear in abundance, you'll have protection over from your enemies, everything will go well with you if you obey. If you do not, he says, you will have war, enemy occupation, your enemy will prevail against you, you will have pestilence, famine, plagues. These things will come upon Israel incrementally if they continue in rebellion. And then at the end of that, God said, if you continue to act with hostility against me, I am going to multiply this 7 times over. And then he says, even if after I do this, you continue to rebel against me, Israel, by what means? By not observing the Shabbats, by idolatry, by desanctifying the temple. If you continue even after 7 times over, I am going to bring upon you the worst possible chastisement, which is, I'm going to drive you out into the nations. Now, part of that, or a large part of that, was that so that the land can receive its Sabbats, because the subsequent verses after that states it clearly. God is driving Israel out so that the land can receive its Sabbats, the Sabbats that they did not give to it. That's the exact terminology that's used there. They denied the land of its Sabbats, and God's going to give the land its Sabbats, what it should have been given by Israel. Now, here's something interesting to think about. You have 1,500 years between Israel's entry into the land and the diaspora from the land, roughly 1,500 years. That's a period of time when Israel defiled the land and defiled, the Shabbats. Now, following 70 AD, all the way up to early 1500s, the land of Israel was barren. Its people were not in the land. Following 1517, after the Sultan Solomon, he provided a way by which Israel can return to the land. So it was in 1517 that the people of Israel began to return to the land. So literally, after the land had received its 1,500 years of Shabbats from the people of Israel, God opened up the door again so that the people of Israel can once again come in. So that speaks to the reality, first of all, of God's commitment to the land of Israel, the very land of Israel, which we don't quite understand.
Right.
What's the deal with God and the land? It's His land. But it speaks of God's commitment, His love for the land of Israel. It also speaks of His commitment to the people of Israel. Because what He said was, while the land is receiving its Sabbats, you, Israel, on the other hand, will be making amends for your sin among the nations. But nevertheless, at the end time, He will bring them back and restore them. So, Jim, if you would read chapter 26, 40 to 45 for us.
If they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their forefathers in their unfaithfulness which they committed against me, and also in their acting with hostility against me, I also was acting with hostility against them to bring them into the land of their enemies. Or if their uncircumcised heart becomes humbled, so that they then make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob And I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham as well. And I will remember the land, for the land shall be abandoned by them, and shall make up for its Sabbaths, while it is made desolate without them. They meanwhile shall be making amends for their iniquity, because they rejected my ordinances, and their soul abhorred my statutes. Yet in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them, nor will I so abhor them as to destroy them, breaking my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God. But I will remember for them the covenant of their ancestors, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of all the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord.
So you have that 1500-year period of Israel occupation of the land. They occupied the land, but they didn't give the land its Sabbaths. And now, following 70 AD, you have roughly 1500 years of the land receiving its Sabbaths, while Israel, as it says, is in the diaspora making amends for their iniquity. Now, it says there that if Israel would repent and return to God. Now, it's incredible because it was during the hardships of the forced conversions and the Inquisition that Israel began to really repent. The leading rabbis in Spain and Portugal were calling for national repentance of the people of Israel. And I believe, and in fact, I know, based on the historiography of Jewish historians, that it was right at that time, I'm talking the 1400s, 1400s, that Israel began to repent nationally. And that happened in Spain, Portugal, and throughout Europe. Now, so you have that period of 1500 years, and then suddenly God opens up the gates for Israel to begin that process of return. It began slowly, and since the 1500s, it's been building incrementally. Now, here we are, where you have more of the Jewish people in the land of Israel than outside the land of Israel. It's never been that way since 70 AD. So we see that God is meticulously carrying out his plan of redemption, right? So Israel came, the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, came to a place of acknowledgement of their guilt and sin. They saw clearly that what God said would happen in Leviticus chapter 26, even in Deuteronomy chapter 24, chapter 4, had been placed upon them. And they repented. And now what God said there in chapter 26 of Leviticus, verse 40 to 45, 44 and 45, is where we are now. God is restoring them because of his covenant, right?
Right.
So God is faithful to his covenant, but he's also faithful to carry out or to execute his chastisement and punishment, which he has upon Israel. I believe that we live in a time today when God has erased the sin of Israel. And now you might say, wait a minute, they're not believers in Jesus. But I believe that the national iniquity of Israel has been removed. And who provided for such a thing? Who shed their blood that something like that can actually happen? Well, Jesus did. You know, in Isaiah chapter 40, Jim, points to a time when God will remove the transgression, the iniquity of Israel. And it's in chapter 40 of Isaiah. Let me read it since I'm here. So Isaiah speaking now. Suddenly, Isaiah shifts his entire focus from chapters 1 to 39. In chapter 40, he begins a whole new perspective. And he says, "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God." So Isaiah is speaking to a people whose God is the God of Israel. And he's saying to them, "Comfort, O comfort my people." So this people is to comfort Israel, right? "Speak kindly to Jerusalem." Jerusalem is synonymous with the people of Israel. "And call out to her that her warfare has ended, that her iniquity has been removed, that God has that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." This is a pivotal scripture because I am convinced it's pointing to where we are today. That God has come to that place now where there's a people in the earth, believers in Messiah Jesus, those who would stand with Israel, identify with Israel. Last week we talked a little bit about Ruth, and how Ruth is an allegorical picture of those in the church that would in fact stand with Israel. So, who is to comfort Israel? Of course, we would maintain that the church,
Right.
the church of Ruth,
Right.
in the allegorical sense. So, when did this happen? All right, so following the 1500s, 1517, what happened? Two monumental things happened in 1517. The Sultan Suleiman provided, he was the king, the empire, the sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He provided that Jews can return to the land of Israel. 1517. 1517, you also have the Reformation.
Martin Luther hung
And
his
suddenly,
theses on the door.
Right.
suddenly, believers have been provided with the means by which they can begin to recognize Israel
Right.
in the Word of God. So this is happening at the very same time. So, mid-1500s, believers begin to gain a Zionistic perspective
Right.
on
Right.
the Bible and what God was doing. So Christian Zionism came into existence right at the same time of the beginning of the ingathering.
Right.
Because
So-
Zionism is all over,
Over
the
the
Bible.
Right.
Before Luther, Christians didn't have Bibles to read, right?
Right.
It was
Right.
So God
relegated
opened
to
up the
special-
literal pathway for Jews to return to the land of Israel, while he opened up the spiritual pathway for believers in Messiah to begin to be a part of what God was doing relative to Zion. And so now here we are, 500 years later, and we can stand and say, we are that people to speak comfort to Israel, to declare to Israel that her iniquity has been removed and that she has received from the Lord's hand double for her sins. Has Israel received double for her sins?
oh yes,
Absolutely.
the
God held
Inquisition, the Holocaust.
over and over the pogroms. God held Israel accountable because we know the words of Yeshua: "To whom much is given, much is
required."
much is required." So God has held Israel accountable for her actions, but we live in a different time. God's favor is upon Israel. We have to believe that. We have to believe that. You know, Isaiah. Now, when this question was first posed to me, and I went home confused and flabbergasted, I studied the word and I said, show me something, God. I want to know that this is it. Otherwise, why am I so excited about Zion? And he took me to Isaiah chapter 11. And he really cleared it up for me in Isaiah chapter 11. He really made it crystal clear for me that this is in fact the Gadol Geula, the great redemption. This is the big one, the great ingathering, the final ingathering. So in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11, Jim?
Then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people, who will remain from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamat, and from the islands of the sea.
So this is important, because God will gather again the second time. When was the first time? I had a pastor once try to debate me on this, and he said, no, the first time was with Egypt. No, Israel was not a nation when they entered into Egypt. They became a nation at Sinai. So that's when Israel had their constitution as a nation. Their existence began then. They came into the land, and then they were driven out when?
Well, 722
With the
for the
Babylonians,
northern, and
but more
586
BC, when Jerusalem was destroyed, and that's when the bulk of the Jewish people were displaced at that
right,
time.
yes.
Now that's the first dispersion, and then the first ingathering occurred then, right?
Right.
You know, Cyrus
Right,
decreed it.
Cyrus.
So that was the first.
But it was a meager ingathering. It was a small
partial. It was a
percentage.
partial gathering.
Right.
But it was an opening,
Something,
right?
right.
So this is the first time that God recovered Israel, brought them
Okay.
into the land.
So the second time means after that.
There's only one other time.
Right.
So this has to be the time, right? This has to be when Israel will be restored. Now, at this period, as it refers to in Isaiah chapter 11, this is the messianic period because of what we see prior to verse 11 in chapter 11, 1 to 5. It's all messianic. 6 to 9 is the messianic period. But then in verse 10, it makes mention of the messianic figure that we know to be the son of David, who is Yeshua.
Right.
So chapter 11, verse 10, and also read verse 12, Jim.
Then it will come about in that day that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, Yishai in Hebrew, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. Verse 12, and he will lift up a standard for the nations, and will assemble the banished ones of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth.
So who is doing this ingathering? The
Root of Jesse.
The son of Jesse, the root of Jesse, the son of David. He's the one that's actually in the process of doing this. It refers to him, or to what he's doing, as a banner, an ensign for all the nations. In other words, this is something that the nations would see. And the Messiah figure here being Yeshua, we believe as believers, is that flag, that banner is, he's restoring Israel. All of the nations have seen this. It is a banner that you cannot miss, an ensign that you cannot miss. And so this is where we are. Today, we're seeing a more complete ingathering. We're seeing what is really revealing this as the actual ingathering is the reaction of the nations. When Israel was made a nation in 1948, it was a year before that the United Nations came into existence. And it seems, when you look at it in retrospect, that the purpose of the United Nations has been consistently to impede Israel.
Right.
It's almost as if they came into existence knowing that their purpose was to impede Israel from ever succeeding to be a nation, a sovereign nation.
And they wouldn't have let Israel be a nation had it not been World War II and
Right.
the Holocaust.
Right.
Absolutely. They had no choice. It was as if God had ordained it in such a way that as much as they hated the idea of recognizing Israel as a nation, they did. But my point is, it seems, and I think it's obvious, that the very purpose and orientation of the UN is to hold back Israel.
Yeah.
Now, today we're seeing the effects of all the years of that pressure, where Israel is acquiescing. Personally, this is horrible. It is horrible for me to see. I dread even looking at the news and perceiving what's happening. Now, does it trouble my faith? No. And we should never let this trouble our faith, because again, when this question concerning a possible dispersion was first posed to me, I was rocked. I couldn't contemplate such a thing. But God brought me to a place of deep faith and conviction that this is that ingathering. Would there be challenges to it in that regard? Would that whole process be challenged? Of course it is. By Israel themselves. Now, despite the fact that I don't like what I see, and this is just me, and I'm seeing traits and tendencies in Israel that frightens me in terms of the way that it's appealing to the world system, I have to maintain, and this is my faith, and we should all be in such a place where we maintain that regardless of what Israel does, they're securely in God's hands. Mm-hmm. God has removed their iniquity, their guilt, their sin, and they may waver, as many of us waver, but ultimately they will come to that place of being that ensign. God has already raised that ensign. The ensign is the reality of the redemption. That's the sign that Yeshua is waving before the nations, that the redemption is here. So, Ruth, the story of Ruth, and Ruth being an archetype of who I am, who we are as believers, Ruth said that where you go, I will go. Where you
lodge or lie down.
Where you die, effectively,
right.
I will die.
Right.
So, from that standpoint, I will die for Israel, with Israel. I will give my life for Israel, with Israel. And that's something that we have to come to terms with. Israel is being restored by God. We have a role in that restoration process. So for me to be able to be there, to encourage, to do exactly what God said that we should do as believers in Messiah, be that source of encouragement to Israel, I will do whatever I need to do in order to be in that position. I am aware of the vaccine being an issue. Right. The vaccine is not the mark of the beast. Could the vaccine actually control my life? On the surface, the reality is I'm not challenged by a vaccine. Now, worse than the vaccine, of course, is the cashless economy that's on the way. That you're not going to be able to get away from that.
Right.
You know, you're not going to be able to avoid it. It's a reality. So, given where we are today in regards to our commitment to Israel, we have to be prepared for what's coming, and what's coming is all-consuming. It is all-consuming. Querying or quarreling over a vaccine will look like nothing in 5 years.
Right.
In 5 years, we'd be dealing with really difficult things. So while we have a chance to be that vessel of encouragement to Israel, we should do whatever it takes to be that vessel,
Including getting the vaccine if we have to.
if needs be.
Yeah,
And that's my position.
me too.
But I'm not quite where I'm settled to take the vaccine. But I know
Right.
that from all indicators, Israel is preparing to mandate that people that are coming in must have the vaccine. So it's a difficult thing. Now back to the issue of the question. I do not believe that Israel will be dispersed again.
Right.
I believe that this is the Geulah. This is it. God is going to
Or
do.
it would say the third time.
Right,
God-
exactly.
God
You
is
do not
going
get
to.
the feeling that it's a cyclical thing, right?
No,
Right.
It
You
is,
cannot.
it is going to happen in that
The
sense.
thing that's making it so obvious that this is it is the way the nations are forming up.
Mm-hmm.
They are falling into lockstep with God's plan. We haven't mentioned this on this program many times, but the whole formation of a world system, the whole formation of a false prophet, a religious order that will go along with the new world order, is God. Those are God's plans.
Mm-hmm.
There are God's plans. God has determined that these things would happen in order to bring an end to the rebellion within man.
The
So
polarization
this
to fish
is-
out
this
who's
is
on
the
which
work-
side of the fence.
this is God's work, and we have to recognize that. It says it there clearly in Revelation chapter 17, that it was God who placed the desire of the beast and the false prophet to bring an end to the system.
Yeah.
It was God working to destroy
Right.
it. So we have to take that into consideration and rejoice in it. That's what the angel says in Revelation chapter 18. To rejoice while God is working out this plan to bring about this final order, the end of this final order. So we have to keep things in a broad perspective and from a macro view. And from a macro view, God is working out his plan of redemption. We have to do whatever we can and whatever we must to fit into it, to be a part of it. We can't run for the hills. This is not a time to run for the hills. I would have said perhaps 100 years ago, I'll run to the hills. Now we cannot. There is no way you can avoid what is coming. It is coming.
Peter said, I'm going fishing.
Yeah. No.
Well, you know, it's
He didn't get away with that either.
Yes, it's curious, but at least in modern times, when Israel has a tendency to start flowing with the nations, right? They start playing tiddlywinks
Yeah.
with all the nations. They're going to do this piece of chord,
Tiddlywinks, I like that.
piece of chord, you know. Something always gets triggered
Correct.
right away to show them that
Yeah.
not a good
Right.
idea. Right?
So you stole my thunder. That's how I was hoping to end. Hoping to end. Yes, I also believe that God will throw a wrench in this whole thing, and he will bring things into his perfect will.
Right.
Israel will, I think, and this would be tough for some people to hear, I think Israel had a moment of potential euphoria with Trump.
Yes.
And that was not real.
Right.
It wasn't real.
It wasn't real. He used everything that he gave them to strong arm them to do what he wanted them to do.
And so in that sense of euphoria, they began to go beyond themselves. They began to see themselves much more capable than they really were, less dependent on God. I think things will occur that will cause them to recognize and remember that they're very dependent on God.
So we know that, right? Because in the book of Revelation, right before Messiah come, Israel's up against the wall, right? If they were going with the nations and doing what the nation wanted, that wouldn't be the situation.
They'll never be able to.
Right.
Zechariah chapter 12, you can't rip that chapter out of your Bible. It's in there. Zechariah chapter 12 is actually this great battle that's forming up around us. It is what we call Armageddon. Israel will be surrounded by all the nations.
Yep.
Her strength and support comes from the house of David in Zechariah chapter 12. But we believe that we, the church that will identify, the church that would in fact lay its life down for Israel, the Ruth reality, that church will be the house of David.
Right.
And that church will be a strong support to Israel based on what we saw in Zechariah chapter 12. So, in regards to our concerns about Israel and a possible diaspora, and Israel being so far out of God's purpose, God has Israel securely in God's hands, and God will bring this to a proper ending on His basis. He will bring this to where He wants it. We, on the other hand, should not be afraid. We should be courageous.
Right.
You know, God spoke to Joshua to be strong, to be courageous. There's evidence that Joshua wasn't exactly that. And the conquest of the land never
Right.
really
At least
occurred.
for a time
Right.
of his leadership.
And in Hebrews chapter 11, he's not mentioned. You figured he would be for sure, but in Hebrews chapter 11, he's omitted from that hall of faith lineup.
Yeah.
Now, I want to walk in faith. In the future annals of those of faith, I want Fellowship Church to be a part of that testament that we walked in faith.
I agree. Don't you think maybe the writer of Hebrews just already had mentioned so many people that they did?
Yeah.
Well,
Joshua was omitted because
but
he
he stopped.
did not.
He stopped the sky.
No, he didn't.
Well,
God did.
okay.
God was illustrating to Joshua what
But-
I can do for you if you trust me. Joshua didn't trust him because 7 years into the conquest, he
Right.
called it kaput.
Yeah.
Right,
So
right.
God calls David a man after his own heart. And I firmly believe that was because David's faith was so strong that there was no fear in him because he always relied on God. And I mean, he was persecuted, he was chased, they were trying to kill him, and nothing mattered. He had this single focus of faith in God. That's what made him a man after God's
All
own
right, so
heart.
Davidic faith is what we should have. A heart after God, as it says in Hebrew, Akil Vavo. So that's where we need to be, regardless of what Israel does or does not do, regardless of what the beast does. Our lives should not be dictated based on what the beast is doing.
Right.
We have a purpose, a function, and we should do what it takes to meet that and to satisfy that and not live in fear.
As our friends in Israel say, it doesn't matter what they do.
Right.
It matters what we do.
Interesting. That keeps coming up.
Yes, all the time.
I keep
And so-
saying it throughout the week in
Yes, me
between
too.
So Israel also says kadima, which means to surge forward.
Right.
And I think that's the word for us, that's the word for me.
Advance.
I'm
right.
surging forward. I am not capitulating to a world order. I am obedient to God. I am not going to run to the hills. I'm not going to stick my head in the sand. I'm going to move forward in God's purpose. And I think it's the only option we have right now, because God is, in fact, completing this work of redemption. If we believe that, if we have that conviction, choices should be easy for us to make.
Right.
Very easy, if we have that conviction.
And that's our program for tonight. And if these questions have raised other questions in your thinking, then feel free to share them with us on our website. And until next week,
Shalom.
Shalom.